Good afternoon. If you want to go ahead and get opened up to the first verse for tonight, it's going to be Exodus chapter 15. Exodus chapter 15. While you're flipping there, figured I'd tell you, I am always constantly in awe of the wisdom of Ryan Boyer. I pull a lot from his life and just the advice that he's given me over the years. And some advice that I've gotten from his life has come to full fruition this afternoon. About 45 minutes ago, I was FaceTiming Katie because she's down in Texas visiting her parents. And she said, "Your hair looks terrible. Do you have time to go get a haircut before you preach tonight?" And I don't think Ryan has had to worry about getting a haircut or his hair being terrible for a few years now. And so, Ryan, you are truly a wise man. Tonight, I want to talk about bitterness. I think it's been a subject that has been brought up quite a few times. I think it's a subject that's important to be addressed, and I think it's just a huge threat that we can manage, each and every one of us. So tonight, opening up, I'm in Exodus chapter 15, and I'm fixing to read verses 22 through 24. Exodus 15, 22 through 24. Then Moses made Israel set out from the Red Sea, and they went into the wilderness of Shur. They went 3 days into the wilderness and found no water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink the water of Marah because it was bitter, therefore it is named Marah. And the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" So I kind of wanted to open with that so we would get our mindset right. Start thinking in terms of bitterness, grumbling, complaining, these sorts of things. And I also wanted to say, I think character studies from the Old Testament are extremely important for these sorts of things because we can see the embodiment of these characteristics. I think back to Phil Robertson when he was here a couple months back. Actually, I think it was a couple years ago, his gospel meeting that he did on Mephibosheth, and talking about who Mephibosheth was and what Mephibosheth went through in his life and how David cared for him. And he presented it in such a way that I had never seen before, and how beautiful the character arc of Mephibosheth was when at the end he said, David had a chair always at his table for Mephibosheth, and so the Lord always has a chair for us at his table. And that just blew my mind, and it was so beautiful. And so I'm not near as eloquent or as skilled as Phil Robertson is, but tonight I hope that we can get a fully fleshed out picture of who Ahithophel was, the counsel of David, who Ahithophel was. So just to once again calibrate our minds, in James chapter 5, verse 17, it says, Elijah was a man with a nature like ours. This is something that I think we overlook when we're digging into the Old Testament, is these are real people. These are real men. These are real events. These are real things that have happened. And if we think inside that they're some sort of superhuman, or if they're the embodiment of evil and everything that they do is wrong and you can't relate, then we miss out on the beauty that is the Old Testament and getting to learn from who these people were. So I'd like tonight to present Ahithophel as a human being, as a man, just like we're men and we're women, who has emotions just like we have and who has lived a life just like we have. So who is Ahithophel? Just some basic background information. I'm going to be quoting quite a few verses, so we might not turn to every single one of them, but I'll be quoting them so that you can look them up on your own time. We know that he was born outside of Jerusalem in Gilho. This is from 2 Samuel 15, verse 12, when he's referred to as Ahithophel the Gilonite. This is a suburb outside of Jerusalem. We also know that Ahithophel was an older man. By the end of his story, he's a great-grandfather, and so he likely would have lived before the time of kings in Israel. He would have lived before Saul became king, through Saul's kingship, and into David's kingship. So we know that he's an old man born outside of Jerusalem. How did he become David's counsel? Or a lot of people refer to him as David's chief counsel because of how highly he's regarded. And this we don't really have a whole lot of insight into scripturally. But if we look at historical examples of who was chosen as the king's chief counsel, I found myself digging down the rabbit hole of the unification of the German and Prussian Empire, and Wilhelm the Great and Otto von Bismarck, but it was a big rabbit hole, and I was there for about 6 hours a couple days ago, so I had to bring it up so it wasn't a waste of time. But these are the people that have been with the leader from the beginning. They hitched their wagon to the leader before he was a leader. when the prospect was still a gamble. To bring this point home, I really want to read 1 Samuel chapter 23. 1 Samuel 23. First Samuel 23, and I'm fixing to read 25 through 28. And Saul and his men went to seek him, and David was told. So he went down to the rock and lived in the wilderness of Maon. And when Saul heard this, he pursued David in the wilderness of Maon. Saul went on one side of the mountain, and David and his men on the other side of the mountain. And David was hurrying to get away from Saul, as Saul and his men were closing in on David and his men to capture them. A messenger came to Saul, saying, "Hurry and come, the Philistines have made raid against the land." So Saul returned from pursuing David and went against the Philistines. We see here, David's on the run. Early in David's life, he was on the run from Saul. He was anything but a sure shot of becoming the next king of Israel. And from historical examples, we can see that the chief council usually had hitched their wagon to the king before it was a sure shot. And so we can assume semi-safely that Ahithophel was with David in this time. Maybe not with him physically in the wilderness, but with him and watching him from afar. So he hitched his wagon to David before it was a sure shot. Then he rose to prominence and was exalted for his high counsel. In 2 Samuel 16:23, we read that his counsel was considered to be that on par with somebody who was talking with God. His counsel was as sure a shot as the word from God himself. And not only was he the counselor in David's court, but in Psalm 41, in the 9th verse, we read that he was David's close friend and ate at his table. So not only is he a counselor to David, not only is he the chief counselor to David, but he's also eating supper with David at his table. So not only would he have seen David, the strong leader, the strong man, and the strong king, but he would have seen David the father. He would have known David's wives. He would have known David's children because he ate at his table. And then in Psalm 55, verse 13, it says, "But it is you, O man, my equal, my companion, my familiar friend. We used to take sweet counsel together within God's house and walk in the throng." When I was reading through the life of Ahithophel, a lot of people attributed Psalm 55, who David was talking about here, as Ahithophel. And so we read here, it sounds like it's not just Ahithophel giving David advice, but David and Ahithophel talking with one another as friends, as companions, as people who take trust in each other's advice. So we see here Ahithophel was an older man from outside of Jerusalem. He hitched his wagon to David before David came into power. He was extremely wise counsel, and he was also David's close friend and person that he ate supper with. But then what else? Ahithophel raised his son Eliam to serve David as one of his mighty men. So we say, who are these mighty men? These are guys like Josheb-Shibbatheth, who wielded a spear, killing 800 men. And then Eleazar, the son of Dodo, the son of Ahoai, killing so many men for David that his sword was stuck in his hand. And then Jesse actually pointed out to me when we were teaching a class together one of my favorite stories of the Bible, which is Benaniah in verse 20 of 2 Samuel 23. And it says, "Benaniah, the son of Jehoiada, was a valiant man of Kabzeel, a doer of great deeds. He struck down 2 Ariels of Moab. He also went down and struck down a lion in a pit in the day that snow had fallen. And he struck down an Egyptian, a handsome man. The Egyptian had a spear in his hand, but Benaniah went down with his staff and snatched the spear out of the Egyptian's hand and killed him with his own spear." These are stories like we would read in Judges. That's who the mighty men are. These are some of my favorite stories in the Bible. I love Judges. I love the stories of the mighty men. And Ahithophel's son, Eliam, is listed among these people. We can see that in 2 Samuel 23, verse 34. Eliam, the son of Ahithophel. So, I've recently, I'm a semi-new father, and Eloise is, toddling around the house. And I've realized she could do literally anything, and I'm just like the most proud dad of all time. Like the first time that she rolled over, I think it was an accident, but I was like, she's a genius. She's going to be a gymnast. This is fantastic. And so I'm so proud of Eloise for doing like almost nothing. You know, it's like she's meeting milestones, and I'm just like, she's the best thing ever. But then think of Ahithophel when he's looking at Eliam, his son, who's listed amongst some of the most powerful men in Israel. You don't get to this point from not being faithful to David. We read stories of the mighty men busting through the camp of the Philistines just to bring David a cup of water. And that's the men that Eliam is close to. So Ahithophel had raised his children to know and to serve and to love David as much as he knew and loved and served David. So this is someone who is intimately tied to David, intimately loves David. But then something happens. Let's flip to 2 Samuel chapter 11. 2 Samuel chapter 11. I'm going to read verses 2 and 3. And it happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch and was walking on the roof of the king's house, and he saw from the roof a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. And David sent and inquired about the woman, and one said, "Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" This is the daughter of Eliam, David's son, or Ahithophel's son. So this is Ahithophel's granddaughter that David is sending after. So let's think about this for a second. We know the story of David and Bathsheba. This is the man that Ahithophel has dedicated his life to. He's served in every way possible. He's ate supper with him at his table. And he knows intimately, he knows his family. He's fully invested and fully involved in David's life. And David knew who Bathsheba was. It was told to him clearly, this is Eliam's daughter. He might not have known before, but he surely knew after who was her grandfather and her father. So this is the ultimate act of betrayal. This is just disgusting on every single level what David does with Bathsheba. But then we don't hear anything about Ahithophel for a while, a couple chapters. And in those chapters, it's about 12 years' time. So what happens in those 12 years? If you flip over, in my Bible, it's just a page to 2 Samuel 13, and verses 11 through 15, we read about how Amnon abuses his sister Tamar. Abuse is used in, to spare some harsh words. And we read that in 2 Samuel 13, 11 through 15. I'll read that right quick. But when she brought them near him to eat, he took hold of her and said, "Come lie with me, my sister." She answered, "No, my brother, do not violate me, for such thing is not done in Israel. Do not do this outrageous thing. As for me, where would I carry my shame? And as for you, you would be one of the outrageous fools of Israel. Now therefore, speak to the king, and he will not withhold me from you." But he would not listen to her, and being stronger than she, he violated her and lied with her. So we read here this horrible thing that happens soon after the sin with Bathsheba. And Ryan said this in a sermon, but this is just the result of what David has done. If you're the son and you see your dad and you say, "Well, my dad has been able to see someone that he wants and do whatever he wants. Why should I not be able to do the same thing?" So this is a direct result of the lifestyle that David has chosen in the past. And so what happens because of this abuse against Amnon? What does David, the righteous king, do? Well, David gets real upset. David gets real mad. But then he does nothing. He doesn't do anything. So David's other son, Tamar's brother, Absalom, in the same chapter, in verses 28 and 29, decides to kill Amnon. And he kills Amnon, and because he knows he's going to be in trouble with his dad, he runs away and stays with his grandpa. So after that time, some time passes, and Absalom comes back. And then 2 years after that, we have the revolt of Absalom. Let's go ahead and read 2 Samuel chapter 15, 10 and 12. But Absalom sent secret messengers throughout the tribe of Israel, saying, "As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpet, then say, 'Absalom is king in Hebron.' But Absalom went with Absalom went 200 men from Jerusalem, and they were invited guests, and they went in their innocence and knew nothing. But while Absalom was offering the sacrifice, he sent for Ahithophel the Gilonite, David's counselor, from his city Gilho. And the conspiracy grew strong, and the people of Absalom kept increasing. And upon hearing of this betrayal, we read David's response in chapter 15, verses 30 and 31. But David went up the ascent of the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went, barefoot with his head covered, and all the people who were with him covered their heads, and they kept weeping as they went. And it was told to David, Ahithophel is among the conspirators of Absalom. And David said, O Lord, please turn the counsel of Ahithophel into foolishness. So I want to take a moment here. This is 12 years down the road between David's sin with Bathsheba and Absalom revolting. I'm sure that there's a fancy like biblical studies name for this war. But Absalom revolting, this is 12 years. And so I'd like to take a moment, because we don't read that Ahithophel left the court of David during that time. Actually, he's referred to as David's counsel here. So that means that Ahithophel served in David's court for that 12 years between David's sin with Bathsheba and now. And at the beginning, we read the verse from James saying that Elijah was a man like we're men, and we can assume Ahithophel was a man like we're men. What does that 12 years look like? This is real life. Do you think, or we know for sure people knew who Bathsheba was. It was not a hidden thing who Bathsheba was. Do you think Ahithophel ever rounded a corner in the palace and heard the guards talking about David and Bathsheba and what David had done to Uriah? What do you think happened in Ahithophel's stomach every time he was in the palace and saw Bathsheba walking through? This is a real man, and these are real questions. So let's think a little bit about how bitterness can grow in our hearts over the course of 12 years of seeing the same exact thing day in and day out. Let's read 2 Samuel 16, 20 through 23. 2 Samuel 16, 20 and 20 through 23. Then Absalom said to Ahithophel, give your counsel, what shall we do? Ahithophel said to Absalom, go into your father's concubines, whom he has left to keep his house, and all Israel will hear that you have made yourself a stench to your father, and the hands of all who are with you will be strengthened. So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and Absalom went into his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. Now in those days the counsel of that Ahithophel gave was as if one consulted the word of God. So was all the counsel of Ahithophel esteemed by both David and Absalom. So we see here, according to Ahithophel's advice, they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof of the king's palace. Now let's think back what else happened on the roof of the king's palace 12 years ago. That's where David saw Bathsheba from. And I know that there's a prophecy from Nathan, but I also think it's safe to assume Ahithophel is a smart man and a bitter man. And so I have to think that there's a little bit of irony here. You ruined my family from this rooftop, and so I'm going to ruin your family on this rooftop. Ahithophel for 12 years has been sitting with his bitterness, looking every day for the opportunity to let his rage and bitterness devour David. Once again, I'd like to point to the fact that this is an older man. Solomon's been born by this point, and so he's now a great-grandfather. And let's read 2 Samuel 17, 1 through 3. Moreover, Ahithophel said to Absalom, let me choose 12,000 men, and I will arise and pursue David tonight. I will come upon him while he is weary and discouraged and throw him into a panic, and all the kings who are with him will flee. I will strike down only the king, and I will bring all the people back to you as a bride comes back to her husband. You seek the life of only one man, and the people will be in peace. This is an older man talking about going out into the field of battle and striking down David, a fantastic warrior. We can read the rage from this text, the bitterness from this text. I will devour David. Send me, let me. So what happens to Ahithophel? what is the end of the story for Ahithophel? We know he doesn't kill David. We're good enough Bible students to know that David goes on and reigns. So what happens to Ahithophel? Well, the Lord uses Hushai, another one of David's counselors, to turn Absalom away from Ahithophel's counsel. Let's flip back to 2 Samuel 15, and I'm fixing to read 31 through 37. Actually, I'm going to do 32 through 37. While David was coming to the summit where God was worshipped, behold, Hushai the Archite came to meet him with his coat torn and dirt on his head. And David said to him, "If you go with me, you will be a burden. But if you return to the city and say to Absalom, I will be your servant, O king, as I have been your father's servant in times past, so now I will be your servant. Then you will defeat for me the counsel of Ahithophel." We can stop there. And then flip over, it's just the next page in chapter 17, verses 7 through 14. Then Hushai said to Absalom, "This time the counsel of Ahithophel that Ahithophel has given is not good." Hushai said, "You know that your father and his men are mighty men, and that they are enraged like a bear robbed of her cubs in the field. Besides, your father is an expert in war. He will not spend the night with the people. Behold, even now he has hidden himself in one of the pits or some other place." We can stop there. We can see that Hushai is giving advice contrary to what Ahithophel had given. And so then, in response to this, Absalom ends up going with the advice of Hushai. And I'd also like to point out, notice here that the only way that Absalom is defeated is because he went away from the advice of Hushai. So he's not so bitter, so muddled-minded that his advice isn't still true. His advice isn't still like holds up strategically. It's just when the Lord gets involved, it goes against what Ahithophel had said. And so what is the end of the story for Ahithophel? And this is 2 Samuel 17, verse 23. 17, verse 23. When Ahithophel saw that his counsel was not followed, he saddled his donkey and went home to his own city. He set his house in order and hung himself, and he died and was buried in the tomb of his fathers. This is the story. That's it. We read in the next chapter that Absalom was also killed. So he goes from hitching his wagon to David, being a wise counselor, training his children to serve David in his house. He eats supper with David. He knows David's family. He loves David. They're talking about being close friends that console one another, walk in the garden together. Then David does this horrible thing to the family of Ahithophel. So then Ahithophel stays in the court for 12 years and serves David for those 12 years. And at the first opportunity to turn his back on David, when Absalom revolts, he does that and he goes with him. And he gives fantastic advice to the house of Absalom. But advice that also is self-serving in the way of saying, you ruined my family from the rooftop, and so I'm going to ruin your family on this rooftop. And then he continues to give advice until the Lord steps in and turns Absalom away from the advice of Ahithophel. And when he sees this, he's failed, his bitterness is for naught, and he goes home and he hangs himself. This is the story of Ahithophel. So, what can we learn from this truly heartbreaking story? What are some points that we can pull from this? Point number 1, even if we are justifiably upset, bitterness brings nothing but sorrow. I heard a quote while I was preparing for this. Bitterness is the poison that we swallow to try and hurt our enemy. None of us would say that Ahithophel wasn't justifiably upset, but allowing bitterness to build and grow like a disease for 12 years rather than growing to be better or growing in forgiveness is unacceptable. Please turn to Hebrews chapter 12. Hebrews chapter 12. And I'm fixing to be in verse 15. Hebrews 12, verse 15. See that no one fails to obtain the grace of God, that no root of bitterness springs up and causes trouble, and by it become defiled. The root of bitterness Michael Schladweiler can probably talk about this a little bit better, about growing plants and stuff like this, but I've been texting him a little bit, and I've noticed the time that he invests in growing his plants. And then you think about the story of Ahithophel, and you think about the term, the root of bitterness. He had been pruning that for 12 years. He had been watering the soil of bitterness in his heart for 12 years, staying in the counsel of David, watching every day as the man who defiled his family is built up to a great king. And I think I do the same thing quite a bit. I let certain small things in my heart grow and fester, and I water the soil, and I put down fertilizer, and I do whatever else Michael Schladweiler suggests for his plants, and I allow it to grow into something that I can't control until I'm talking like Ahithophel, the old man talking about how he's fixing to go out to war and strike down David. So that's point number one. Even if we are justifiably upset, bitterness brings nothing but sorrow. Point number two, bitterness loves company. Bitterness loves to have someone to talk to. We see this with Ahithophel and Absalom. Something that I've noticed in my very limited life experience is that bitter people always find one another. A good example of this is when I was on Camp Friends with Sarah. You'd go to camp and you'd see these two kids from opposite sides of the state, and you could just tell by their face that they had a bad attitude, and they'd never met each other. But on the first day of camp, before registration, they would find each other, and they would be stuck at the hip for the rest of the week, doing nothing but complaining for the rest of the week. It's pretty funny to watch. It's crazy how they find each other. It's like magnets. But isn't it the same for us? I think about at work. I work for a consultant firm, and so we have to deal with external clients day in, day out. And if the client gets a little too mean to me or talks a little down to me, I can get down in my heart and I can get bitter. And then I know there's a couple guys that I can just shoot off to and just be like, can you believe they said this? And we find each other and we commiserate with one another. And then by the end of it, I feel disgusting. I'm not sharing my example with them. And it's just one big self-pity ball that is formed. We need to be watchful of who we're drawing close to and why we're close to them. Are we constantly talking poorly of others and slights of our brothers? Let's flip to Psalm. I'm fixing to read Psalm 133, the whole chapter, all 3 verses. Behold, how good and pleasant it is when brothers dwell in unity. It is like precious oil on the head, running down on the beard of Aaron, running down on the collar of his robe. It is like the dew of Hermon, which falls from mountains on Zion. For the Lord has commanded the blessing, life forevermore. Are we being that blessing to our brothers when we're commiserating? Are we being that blessing to our brothers whenever we're doing nothing but being bitter and building up one another's bitterness? I don't think so. So, point number 1, even if we're justifiably upset, being bitter brings nothing but sorrow. Point number 2, bitterness loves company. And point number 3, bitterness causes us to overlook forgiveness and even blessings in our life. We read in Acts chapter 13, verse 22, David is referred to as a man after God's own heart. So 1,000 years after David's dead, he's remembered in Acts as a man after God's own heart. But what is Ahithophel remembered for? Though he made egregious sin and involved so many people, and he was blatantly wrong, he was forgiven. And after his death, he's remembered as a man after God's own heart. But then let's also think, I keep referring to Ahithophel as a great-grandfather. Who is his great-grandson? Solomon. What did Solomon do in his lifetime? He served as king during the Pax Romana of Israel. This is Israel at its pinnacle power, pinnacle wealth. He's a wise king. The land of Israel is so richly blessed during the life of Solomon. And yet we don't hear anything about Ahithophel in that time because he's dead, because he decided to be bitter rather than to look forward to his grandson, his great-grandson. So he didn't see the blessings in his life because he decided to stay bitter. So, point 1, even if we're justifiably upset, bitterness brings nothing but sorrow. Point 2, bitterness loves company. And point 3, bitterness causes us to overlook forgiveness and blessings in our life. So I've said a lot about being bitter and why we shouldn't be bitter. But how do we go about not being bitter? Let's go back to Exodus chapter 15 one more time. Exodus chapter 15. And once again, I'm fixing to read 22, but this time through 25. Then Moses made Israel set out from the Red Sea, and they went into the wilderness of Shur. They went 3 days into the wilderness and found no water. When they came to Marah, they could not drink the water of Marah because it was bitter. Therefore it was named Marah. And the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" And now in 25, and he cried to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a log, and he threw it in the water, and the water became sweet. So, brief recap of where the people of Israel have been. They were just pulled out of Israel from their life of slavery and bondage. The Lord has provided them a leader in Moses, and then the Lord also led them with a pillar of cloud by day and fire by night. Once Egypt had begun to chase them to turn them back into slaves, the Lord parted the Red Sea miraculously, and they walked across on dry ground, and then swallowed up the Egyptians in the Red Sea as they chased them. Now at the beginning of the chapter 15, we have the first recorded song in the Old Testament. They're so overcome with thankfulness and joy that they pour out their heart in worship for the Lord, for the God that saved them, provided that for them, and was now leading them. But before the lyrics of the song could leave their head, they realized how thirsty they were. They came upon water and realized it was bitter, thereby being undrinkable. And they grumbled against Moses. I think now is a good time for a sub-point about grumbling. Grumbling is nothing but the ugly twin sister of bitterness, and they always walk together. So they say to Moses, "What shall we drink?" As if Moses had not also been walking with them for 3 days in the desert, and also standing at the pit of undrinkable water. And what was Moses' response? He cried out to the Lord. Such a simple response that I often overlook. But then what does the Lord do? He opens Moses' eyes to the log nearby. The ESV translates it log. The King James, New American Standard Bible, and the Holman Christian Standard Bible replace the word log with tree, which I like a little better. So what does God do in this situation? Well, let's start with what he doesn't do. He doesn't do a miracle by removing all the water and then replace it with new sweet water. He doesn't take them to another spring down the road where water's better. He doesn't send water from the sky in the form of rain like he's fixing to do in the next chapter or next few chapters with manna. And he doesn't pull water from the rock like he's fixing to do in a couple chapters as well. What does he do? The Lord provided a tree to be put in the water, which changed it. Verse 25, he threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. Became sweet. It's the same water. So what does this mean for us? Well, first I kind of want to break down bitterness. And I think there's two real broad camps of what bitterness is. There's horizontal bitterness, and then there's vertical bitterness. First is horizontal. This one is against our brothers or sisters in Christ, a co-worker, a neighbor, an elder, a preacher, a friend, parent, brother, spouse, child, has done something to me that they've done actual harm or perceived harm to me. They've gossiped about me, slandered, cheated me, stole from me, taken advantage, left me out, ignored or chewed me out. This isn't something that I can get over or move past. For some reason, this is stuck with me, and it is the root of bitterness inside. It's growing up. I have taken the poison of bitterness trying to harm them, but in reality, it is only poisoning me. I have allowed myself to become the bitter, undrinkable water. So what do I do? What did the Lord do for Moses when presented with bitter water? He shows him the tree. 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 24, he himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live in righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. We need to take it to the tree, and we need to take it to the tree. You can't count on the situation around you changing. You need to look at the only thing that can change you, which is the tree of Christ's crucifixion. Forgiveness and reconciliation in our lives only come from an understanding of the forgiveness and reconciliation that come from Christ's sacrifice on the cross for us. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 31 and 32. Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and slander be put away from you, along with all malice. Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, as God in Christ forgives you. When we understand this, the only response is to seek to show the forgiveness and reconciliation that Christ first showed us on the cross. So that's horizontal. What has Ryan Giesing done to me? I'm letting myself become bitter. I need to look to the cross. So the next is vertical. Something in your life is wrong, and this isn't something that a man in the world could do to you. You're sick, your child is sick, your family's in disarray, any number of things, and you ask yourself, why is God doing this to me? You allow your heart to be poisoned by thinking, what kind of God will let this happen? And you can't get over or through it. Look to the tree. In looking at the tree, you realize that our God is a God who loves us and cares for us in the only way that truly matters. He has provided us a way to be with him. And this wasn't him paying $5 in a tank of gas for our sins. The cost was him sending his son, his only son, whom he loved, to be beaten up, spit upon, whipped, and hung on a cross with nails through his hands and feet, and then stabbed in the side with spears. And the only response that we should have is to see that the Lord paid everything for us to have a relationship with him. So, how do we get through bitterness? Well, how did they get through bitterness in Exodus chapter 15? Through the tree. If you're struggling with bitterness, look to the tree. Look at Christ's crucifixion and cry out to the Lord, help us, help me. If you're struggling with bitterness or anything else, or maybe you haven't yet heard the plan that God has set apart in his word for a relationship with him, please come forward now as we stand and as we sing.